Hi everyone, this is Scott. For maps, references, and images for each episode, as well as links to all my social media, please go to ancientworldpodcast.com. And if you'd like to support the show, please go to patreon.com/theancientworld. Thanks again for listening. The Kura River descends from the imposing heights of the central Caucasus mountain range, flowing southwest across a lowland plain before emptying into the Caspian Sea. The Araxes River begins its journey in the Armenian highlands, a few miles from the source of the Euphrates, before taking a more meandering path to join the course of the Kura. In the 4th millennium BC, both rivers nourished a culture that in modern times was given their names, the Kura-Araxes. The Kura-Araxes were mainly farmers and herdsmen, but the farming they practiced in places like the Ararat Valley was fairly small scale and never required the high-level coordination or generated the types of surpluses that might open the door to social hierarchy. Wealth remained moderate and evenly distributed, and warfare all but absent. So the Kura-Araxes archaeological signature is characterized by small villages of mud brick, single-room family homes of a fairly uniform stature. Both the Great and Lesser Caucasus ranges were rich in metal deposits, particularly copper, and artifacts show that the Kura-Araxes were skilled in metal production. Doing so required, as Liam Neeson might say, a very particular set of skills. This included finding and extracting metallic ores, smelting the metal from the ore, refining it to remove impurities, and casting or forging the metal into a final crafted object. Alina Kuzmina notes that in this era, the only easily exploitable deposits were those both visible to the naked eye and composed of oxidized ores that could be smelted at reasonable temperatures. So it's unsurprising that mountainous regions rich in minerals, like the Caucasus, Armenia, Anatolia, and Iran, are where these skills first developed. At the center of each Kura-Araxes home was a hearth or andiron used for cooking and heating. Per Claudia and Antonia Sagona, hearth designs mirrored living forms, ranging from a two-pronged design resembling animal horns to a horseshoe shape featuring the faces of animals or humans. Repeated and careful deposition of certain items around these hearths suggests their special significance. Since the Kura-Araxes had no temples, the author suggests the religion they practiced was in their homes around their hearths. It also may have been tied to the mysteries of metalworking. Per Philip L. Cole, the mid-4th millennium BC, the same time frame as the Uruk expansion, saw the sudden appearance of Kura-Araxes settlements all across Transcaucasia, the region just south of the Caucasus Mountains, as well as parts of eastern Anatolia, which is where they first encountered lowland settlers recently arrived from Mesopotamia. The closest known Sumerian colony was at the ancient site of Tepe Gawra, Kurdish for Great Mound, near Mosul in northern Iraq. Like at Tepe Gawra, Sumerian culture didn't leave much trace on Kura-Araxes society, though it did introduce cuneiform writing to eastern Anatolia. Around 3100 BC, for reasons unknown, the situation drastically changed. Sumerian settlements in the north were abandoned, and at almost the exact same time, the Kura-Araxes expanded to fill the void. The sequence of events is poorly understood. It's unclear whether the Sumerians were forcibly expelled or whether the Kura-Araxes only moved south in the wake of their sudden departure. And while the Kura-Araxes may have been pulled, By the opening up of attractive sites and the search for new sources of metal, they also may have been pushed. Just north of the Kura-Araxes' homeland, along the coast of the Caspian Sea, was the primary route in ancient times for circumventing the Caucasus Mountains. Herodotus flags it as the corridor used by the Scythians and Cimmerians to invade the Iron Age Near East. At the time of our story, the late 4th millennium BC, the route saw successive waves of northern steppe herders moving south around the Caucasus. Along with their two-wheeled ox-driven carts, these steppe herders imported a freaky new animal that few Near Easterners had ever encountered. It was called, let me check my notes, yes, a horse. Either pushed, pulled, or a little of both, the Kura-Araxes were definitely on the move. Their migrations took them off in two broad directions. Some spread southwest across the Armenian plateau into Anatolia and Syria. Their most remote confirmed outpost along this trajectory was at Khirbet Kerak in northern Israel, where the Sea of Galilee empties into the Jordan, which I don't need to tell you is pretty darn far. Others spread southeast across the Iranian plateau as far as Godin Tepe, near the source of the Diyala River in the eastern Zagros Mountains. In the early 3rd millennium BC, several prominent cities developed in regions settled by the Kura-Araxes. Along with Semitic and Sumerian, their population spoke another language related to neither, a language later called Hurrian. From overlaying Kura-Araxes' archaeological remains and Hurrian linguistic maps, it's likely that the Kura-Araxes were the people known as the Hurrians. Hurrian language and culture would retain a prominent hold on the north for the next few thousand years, in parallel to, but distinct from, the cultures of Mesopotamia. While we're up in the north, I wanted to swing back by Arslan Tepe, Hill of the Lion, the later Iron Age Malachia. As I mentioned last episode, the city had been touched by the Uruk expansion, and locals had been inspired to build their own Sumerian-style temple. But, per David Graeber and David Wengrow, shortly after the Uruk collapse, the temple was demolished and replaced by a massive new structure, with living quarters, an audience chamber, storage rooms, and, perhaps most notably, an armory. Per the authors, the contents, including possibly the earliest known bronze swords, may point to one of the world's first warrior aristocracies. Elites who lived at Arslan Tepe were heavily armed with spears and swords and lived in hill forts or small palaces. They buried their dead with enormous quantities of metal weaponry, personal jewelry, elaborate textiles, and drinking gear. The authors suggest that the culture emerged in reaction to the Uruk expansion, or, as they put it, in direct opposition to the more egalitarian societies of the Mesopotamian plains, which would soon be taking a drastic turn in a much more competitive direction. The culture may have also been formed in response to a second invasion. Per Cole, the subsequent Kura-Araxes expansion into eastern Turkey likely resulted in significant interaction, including possibly armed confrontation, with this newly formed warrior aristocracy. The conflict may have endured for centuries, even as the Kura-Araxes continued their expansion south. Before we leave the Caucasus behind, I wanted to touch on one more culture that flourished in the mid-4th millennium. They're known as the Maikop, named after the Russian town where their remains were first uncovered. While the Kura-Araxes lived in the Trans-Caucasus, the region south of the Caucasus Mountains, the Maikop lived just north of the Caucasus and in the adjacent Kuban River Valley. Like their southern neighbors, they herded animals, mostly cattle, and practiced an inventive form of agriculture, using artificial terraces built in the local mountains. Also like the Kura-Araxes, the Maikop were serious metalheads. Up to this point, copper was the most widely used metal in the ancient world, giving its name to the current era, the Chalcolithic or Copper Stone Age. Per David W. Anthony, Maikop metallurgists were among the first to deduce that doubling the natural arsenic content of copper ore made the metal easier to cast. It also made the end product lighter colored, harder, and better able to hold a cutting edge. This alloy, called arsenical bronze, came into use around 3500 BC. Not only was it highly prized, but it also heralded a brand new era. Say it with me here, people, the Bronze Age. Just to mention it, the advantages of arsenical bronze were later surpassed by using copper and tin to make tin bronze, an alloy even lighter in color, harder, and easier to work with. The thing was, tin was a very rare metal in the ancient world, with only a single verified source, the Zarafshan River Valley in modern Tajikistan. More than 1,000 years later, in the early 23rd century BC, when the Akkadian king Ramush wanted to make a life-size statue of himself using the world's most valuable metal, the metal he chose was tin. Archaeologists found few Maikop settlements, but numerous Maikop graves, typically built in the mound or kurgan style. From these graves, we know that Maikop chieftains were incredibly, ridiculously wealthy. The reasons aren't too hard to unpack. Their strategic location and skill at crafting items using arsenical bronze made the Maikop an important hub in a burgeoning regional trade. The strategic location takes a bit of unpacking. It was mainly a north-south thing. First off, the Maikop traded metals, both copper and bronze, to their neighbors on the northern steppe. Per Anthony, one contemporary steppe settlement may have even hosted a Maikop colony. It's unclear what the Maikop got in exchange, possibly wool from an early breed of wool-bearing sheep, or possibly cannabis products. Because the Scythians were apparently not the first steppe dwellers who enjoyed partaking of the weed. All we know is whatever they got left no archaeological trace. Another possible import was an animal common on the northern steppe but virtually unknown elsewhere: the horse, or more specifically, the domesticated horse. Horse remains and horse imagery become increasingly common at Maikop sites after 3500 BC, just as they do south of the Caucasus in the lands of the Kura-Araxes. And just to mention it, horses, like cattle, were originally domesticated as sources of meat. Their growing popularity may have been due to a recent innovation called horse riding. The Maikop also traded to the south. The metal they used to craft copper and bronze items came from somewhere south of the Caucasus, so the Kura-Araxes must have been a major trading partner. Which is why it's surprising that there's almost zero sign of two-way cultural exchange. Equally surprising, the strongest southern Maikop connection was all the way down in Sumer, which was very likely a product of the Uruk expansion. Like in the north, the Maikop exports were copper and bronze, possibly shipped south along the Black Sea coast, then transported overland to a navigable stretch of the Euphrates. From there on, it was smooth sailing all the way down to Sumer. As far as what the Maikop got in return, we at least know some high-end items. Anthony relates that the semi-royal figure buried under a giant Maikop chieftain's kurgan wore Mesopotamian ornaments in an ostentatious funeral display that has no known parallel, even in Mesopotamia. They included a tunic covered with golden lions and bulls, silver-sheathed staves with solid gold and silver bulls, and silver sheet metal cups. The lions and bulls, as well as other objects with animal procession motifs, had clearly been sourced from Mesopotamia. Even trading to the north and south was only part of the Maikop story. The source materials of other finds, turquoise, lapis lazuli, and carnelian, originated in Iran, Central Asia, and Pakistan, respectively. A grave at another Maikop site held 15 heavy bronze daggers, 3 sleeved axes, 2 cast bronze hammer axes, and an early sword some 2 feet long, in competition with those at Arslan Tepe for the title of world's oldest sword. Per Warwick Ball, Maikop graves also hold the remains of some of the earliest disassembled wagons ever recovered. The contacts with Sumer were apparently vital to ongoing Maikop prosperity, because around 3100 BC, when the Uruk expansion came to an end and Sumerian wagons rolled back toward the south, the Maikop civilization suddenly collapsed. Its people apparently departed the region, and its former lands were quickly subsumed by aggressive northern steppe tribes. The same tribes who, before too long, would start making their way around the Caucasus into Kura-Araxes territory. Where did the Maikop go? We don't really know. They may have headed off in ships, sailing along the Black Sea coast to try their luck in northern Anatolia. Ball highlights that burial methods and royal standards at later sites like Alaka-Hoyuk show certain similarities to Maikop culture. These later burials are associated with the Hattians, the people who preceded and laid much of the groundwork for the Middle Bronze Age Hittites. At the same time as the Maikop collapse, at the western end of Anatolia, some recent European immigrants were setting up shop. The language they spoke was an early branch of Proto-Indo-European, one related to dozens of languages still spoken in the modern world, including the one I'm speaking right now. Per Anthony, these newcomers may have founded a brand new settlement along the Aegean coast. Inside a small citadel with massive walls, the immigrants raised a large stone stele with a relief of an armed warrior. A fitting enough inauguration for a site that would later be known as Homer's Troy. Father of history or father of lies, he's always good for a quote. Not only is the Egyptian climate peculiar to that country, and the Nile different in the way it behaves from rivers elsewhere, but the manners and customs of the Egyptians themselves seem to be the opposite of the typical practices of mankind. Herodotus happened to visit Egypt at a pretty crazy time. In the early 450s BC, the rebel pharaoh Inaros II, with a little help from the Athenian navy, briefly broke the Persian hold on Egypt. So curious Greeks, like our budding historian, had a chance to see the sights. Take the quote with a grain of salt, but it's true the Egyptians and the Nile had their own unique way of doing things. The Nile is the world's longest river. It's mainly fed by the Blue Nile, which originates from rainfall in the highlands of Ethiopia, and the White Nile, which comes from the runoff from a series of East African lakes, both of which converge in modern Sudan. Summer rains fill the river with water, silt, and vegetation, and by fall each year, the Nile in Egypt overflowed its banks, spreading a rich deposit of organic silt across the adjacent lands. The Egyptians called this fertile region Kemet, the Black Land, in contrast with the dry and barren Red Land, which they called Deshret. which sounds amazingly close to desert, but they're apparently different derivations. These seasonal floodwaters also rejuvenated nearby Lake Fayoum, often called the Fayoum Oasis, around 50 miles southwest of modern Cairo. And per John Romer, grain storage bins at Lake Fayoum, dated to roughly 5000 BC, are the earliest evidence we have for Egyptian agriculture. At this time, most Egyptians were hunters, fishers, and herders, mainly of cattle and sheep. But once they noticed the bounteous growth that followed each flood, they began to use the yearly cycle to grow some wheat and barley. Movement between Egypt, the Sinai, and southern Syria was relatively common, and important aspects of these farmers' lives, the animals they herded, the crops they grew, and even the design of their sickles and storage bins, were early Levantine imports. Not formal quote-unquote imports, just stuff introduced by semi-nomadic herdsmen making their way down from southern Syria. When summer returned and the land dried out, these Fayoum farmers resumed their own semi-nomadic lifestyle. In addition to all its life-giving qualities, the Nile was also a highway, taking traffic north with its natural flow or south with the prevailing winds. As the 5th millennium BC progressed, small semi-permanent farming communities were established all down its length. This was also the era when Egyptians stopped burying their dead beneath homes and started to place them in cemeteries. Contemporary grave goods included jewelry of ivory, seashells, copper, and semi-precious stones, as well as pouches holding the ingredients of body paint. The ingredients were ground on small stone pallets that were sometimes buried with the dead. Moving into the 4th millennium, one group became increasingly prominent. The Naqadan culture began in Upper Egypt, far upstream of the Delta. The culture was identified in modern times by the detailed imagery on its pottery, which often depicted life on the ancient Nile. Their 3 main pottery production centers, at Naqada, Abydos, and Hierakonpolis, were also centers of baking and brewing, which, as Romer notes, makes sense. Bread makers required pottery molds in which to bake their loaves, and brewers needed pots to decant their brews. Of course, bread and beer needed wheat and barley, and agricultural production at Naqadan sites generated Egypt's first food surpluses, which led to craft specialization, increasing grave goods, and evidence of public feasting. Near an oval courtyard at Hierakonpolis, dating to roughly 3500, razor-sharp flint knives were used to butcher large numbers of animals, mainly cattle. Oval courtyards at other sites apparently served the same purpose. Per Romer, they all featured an artificially sloped floor to serve as a drain for running blood. And here's where things take a pretty dark turn. I mean, if you're vegan, it's already pretty dark. But apparently it wasn't just animals being slaughtered. Bodies interred at nearby cemeteries show signs of intentional dismemberment. On other bodies, masses of small cuts on some of the skulls show that several people had been expertly scalped. Others had apparently been bludgeoned to death, struck by objects directed with such force that skulls had shattered like teacups. The wounds were consistent with those produced by rounded small stone maces, the type often found in contemporary Naqadan male graves. The position of the strike suggests that the hair on the top of the victims' heads may have been held to steady the blow, which many of you recognize as the exact same pose known as the icon of majesty that's a centerpiece of so much later pharaonic imagery. The slaughter appears to mark the emergence of a new Naqadan elite. Along with exercising power over life and death, At least in certain ritual settings, they were also preoccupied with caring for deceased ancestors. Bodies were treated with embalming oils and enclosed in linen wrappings, an early version of the later process of pharaonic mummification. Per Graeber and Wengrau, the Nacadans had also come to believe that regular offerings of bread and beer were needed to sustain the dead in the afterlife. As odd as it seems, and it's pretty darn odd, this belief may have led to the increased production that led to the increased hierarchy. Per the authors, Naccadan society soon found itself divided between those with sufficient arable land, plows, and oxen to provide for the needs of deceased ancestors, and others who lacked these newfound essentials and were forced to go into debt to obtain them. As a result, the gradual extension of elite authority throughout Egypt began with the creation of estates dedicated to organizing the provision not so much of living elites, but of dead ones. Like in contemporary Sumer, writing began as an accounting tool to document these offerings. And like cuneiform, hieroglyphic writing had a long development process. It took 500 years from the earliest symbols to the earliest hieroglyphic sentence, and centuries more before anything like actual literature. But still, it was another arrow in the Nakkada quiver, and a helpful tool for archaeologists to track their budding expansion. Up to now, Nakkadan culture was mainly confined to the south, but that was about to change. At the time, the Nile Delta hosted a second culture known as the Ma'adi. Since the region had plenty of fish and game, they never had much incentive to practice agriculture. But they did have a few things the Nakkadans didn't, namely close ties to southern Syria and, in particular, to the trade in Levantine copper. Unlike its only contemporary alternative, flint, copper allowed things to be crafted with much greater accuracy. Around this time, the Mahdi began importing copper tools and trading them upriver to the Nakkada. Images from a contemporary tomb show that Nakkadan riverboats had been drastically enlarged and reinforced to carry more passengers and goods. The advancement was likely a direct result of the increased accuracy and productivity bestowed by copper tools. Most consequently, these new boats allowed the Nakkadans to expand from their original homeland in Upper Egypt all the way north to the Delta. As far as we can tell, this colonization was a gradual, peaceful process, not some sudden, violent invasion. Relations with the Mahdi remained amicable, and signs of warfare are completely absent. No burnt-out buildings or fallen walls, no bodies in cemeteries with signs of violence or combat. It's more akin to the Uruk expansion, which happened at the exact same time. Imported Nakkadan lifestyle improvements included herding domesticated sheep and cattle and practicing large-scale agriculture, as well as the technologies of baking, brewing, and early hieroglyphic writing. But they also imported cultural elements like preservation of the dead and increasing hierarchy, whose value was much more ambiguous. Speaking of the Uruk expansion, even as this process was unfolding, another contemporary Levantine import was setting up cultural shop, Mesopotamian imagery. The Uruk expansion never reached Egypt. It never even really got close. But its effects were felt in northern Syria, found their way to southern Syria, and likely rode shotgun with other imports all the way down the Nile. As it happens, the Sumerians had a perfect medium for concentrated cultural transmission. It was small, it was strong, it was very attractive, typically cut from semi-precious stones, and when you rolled it in clay, it conjured scenes of a mysterious alien world. It was, of course, the cylinder seal. In the period we're discussing, Between around 3500 and 3200 BC, seal impressions became increasingly common in cemeteries all along the Nile. Many showed Mesopotamian fantasy creatures, like panthers with long curved necks, imagery that also made its way onto contemporary carved stone palettes. The Naqadans also adapted the seals to portray more traditional subjects. The most enduring artistic impact was the concept of depicting a long, continuous scene between a defined upper and lower border. It's this same comic strip approach that would be used for so much later pharaonic art. All of which brings us, more or less, to the era of the Scorpion King, which is a story I'll get to right after this short break.
What does every USAA member have in common? Family. We're one big family who supports the military community and their eligible families. And if you, your parent, or spouse served, you could join our family and save big on auto insurance. Visit USAA.com/join today to check your eligibility. Membership eligibility and product restrictions apply and are subject to change. USAA means United Services Automobile Association and its affiliates, San Antonio, Texas.
This message is brought to you by Abercrombie Kids, where the activewear is made for every summer activity, so your mini-me can bring their personal best. Summer days are always an adventure, from day camp to rec leagues and pool days. Abercrombie Kids has the shorts, tees, and swim to keep them comfy and keep up with them. Get everything for the entire summer at Abercrombie Kids. Shop in-store, online, or in the app.
Yes, my friends, it is time to wrestle with the Scorpion King. And it turns out that 2002 movie starring Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson was actually like 90% accurate. Okay, I'm joking. Though it was probably way more accurate than Gladiator 2. An enormous tomb unearthed at Abydos, dating to roughly 3200 BC, held lavish grave goods, including 4,500 liters of wine. The tomb was also decorated with some 60 images of scorpions. A mace head recovered from Hierakonpolis and dated to the same time bears the earliest known image of a man wearing pharaonic regalia, with the glyph of a scorpion floating in front of him, all of which is compelling evidence for a pre-dynastic ruler named Scorpion. If such a figure did exist, he was apparently far from alone. Per Graeber and Wengrau, archaeology reveals that the contemporary Nile saw a surfeit of tiny kingdoms and miniature courts, some of them quite magnificent, each congealing around a core group of blood relatives. Animal images, including crocodiles, elephants, and hawks, are associated with many of these figures. Per Stephen Snape, excavations at Hierakonpolis have uncovered a great number of objects depicting scenes of warfare and enemies being slaughtered, suggesting that violence was a major feature of the period. A range of weaponry, including spears, shields, bows, and maces, was also being developed at this time. Rock graffiti west of Thebes appears to show King Scorpion's victory over another figure called Bull's Head or Taurus. Another king called Double Falcon appeared to rule the eastern delta, though his inscriptions range from Abydos to Canaan. The earliest such figure was Eri Hor, or Horus Mouth. Though he likely ruled from Hierakonpolis, his inscriptions pop up near the Delta and in the Sinai Peninsula. By the way, Eri Hor's inscriptions put him in the running for earliest living historical figure whose name we actually know, which is kind of a crazy thing. Per Romer, the mace head depicting the Scorpion King was found in a single sealed context that included objects from both the last phases of prehistoric Naqadan culture and the beginnings of ancient Egyptian history. 3 recovered mace heads and a palette provide most of the surviving evidence of the invention of the office of pharaoh. The figure they depict is larger than others, seated on a throne, accompanied by servants, in the same dress and with the same objects, crowns, sticks, and maces, as all his royal successors. All these objects bear a common glyph. Within a rectangular pattern of lines known as a serek, meant to represent the front of a palace, are the Egyptian hieroglyphs for catfish and chisel, nar and myrrh. Taken as a whole, the glyph represents the royal house of Narmer. The most famous of these objects is the Narmer palette. And even before you get to the imagery, it's already told you a lot. First off, it's made of siltstone mined at Wadi Hammamat, between Nakada and the Red Sea coast, and its outline is shaped like a Nakadan storage jar. But yes, let's get to the imagery. The figure of Narmer dominates one side, wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt. He's accompanied by a sandal bearer as he grabs a foreign captive by the head with his mace raised up for the kill. The opposite side is dominated by two Mesopotamian-style creatures with serpentine and twining necks. The necks enclose a small depression that reveals the palette's practical use, to grind cosmetic pigments. The same side shows Narmer wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt, accompanied by his sandal bearer and the oldest known depiction of standard bearers, reviewing rows of beheaded captives. Another scene shows Narmer in the form of a bull bursting through city walls to trample a helpless enemy. The top of both sides features Narmer's serek, flanked by busts of the cow goddess Hathor. In fact, if you look really close, Narmer's belt has 4 beaded tassels, each topped by an image of Hathor. The belt also sports a bull's tail hanging down the back. The scenes reflect aspects of the new pharaonic order, particularly state-sanctioned violence. Per Romer, at least in this early period, this order was regularly reinforced by the royal flotilla arriving at a settlement and setting up court inside a designated area, where the king was enthroned and various scenes of tithing, butchery, and presentation unfolded beneath him. The Nakadans also introduced a new symbol, or at least one assigned a new preeminence, the image of the hawk. Texts relate the early foundation of shrines to the hawk god Horus, first at Edfu near Hierakonpolis, then pretty much everywhere else. A few of Narmer's immediate successors included the hawk god as part of their name, including Hor-Aha, the fighting Horus, Jet, the Horus cobra, and Hor-Den, the Horus who strikes. As far as we can tell, the people who these pharaohs were fighting and striking were those of the lands on Egypt's periphery, mainly Nubia, the Sinai Peninsula, and Canaan. Nakadan colonies in the Nile Delta presented a few special challenges. Delta farms needed raw materials like flint and copper to make their farming tools. The resulting produce then had to be collected for dispersal to local communities. Logistically, the optimal location to store these goods, raw materials and produce, was just a bit south of the delta, which is where the Nakadans built warehouses, shipyards, and homes for managers and workers, which very well may be the origin story of the legendary city of Memphis. At this stage, the site was called Enebu Hedge, the Fortress of the White Walls. Its oldest mention by this name was a rock inscription by Iri Hor, so decades before King Narmer. It wasn't until the New Kingdom era, around 1500 years later, that the city became known as Memphis, for Men-Nefer, meaning enduring and beautiful. After Narmer's passing, Memphis would remain the Egyptian capital for the first 6 consecutive dynasties, the entire duration of the Egyptian Old Kingdom. A mud brick tomb excavated at Nakata is believed to hold the remains of Narmer's wife, Queen Neith-hotep, mother of his son and successor, Hor-Aha. Narmer himself was buried at Abydos, close to his power base of Thinis, as were the rest of his dynasty. All were buried in underground crypts that were flagged by large stone stelae. And it's largely based on these early tombs that their ruling sequence was first established. It was later confirmed by contemporary kings lists, and also lined up more or less with another ancient source, Manetho's Aegyptiaca. Manetho was a Greco-Egyptian priest who lived in Heliopolis around 300 BC. As a priest and advisor to Ptolemy I, Manetho had access to the best available historical records, including both scrolls and temple inscriptions, which he used to compile his Egyptian history. As part of this effort, he grouped the pharaohs into 30 dynasties. From the quote-unquote unification of Egypt around 3150 BC to the death of the last native Egyptian pharaoh, Nectanebo II, in 343 BC. Doing so was a novel approach, but appeared to capture the ebbs and flows of ancient Egyptian history. We don't know much of these early pharaohs, but let's go one by one. According to Manetho, Narmer reigned for 30 years and advanced with his army beyond the frontiers of his realm, winning renown by his exploits. These were likely Canaanite campaigns, like the one depicted on his palette. Complexities of unification aside, Narmer was apparently the first southern king to exert firm control over the north. How did his story end? Well, similar to Keti 1,000 years later, the king was carried off by a hippopotamus. Seriously, they may look cute, but they're actually super aggressive. According to Manetho, it was Narmer's son, Hor-Aha, the Fighting Horus, who first made Memphis his capital. In addition to building a palace there, and likely building the tomb of his mother, Neith-hotep, he may have built a temple to the war goddess Neith at Sais in the western Nile Delta. Given this was probably newly won territory, it could have been seen as a generous act or as a symbol of Memphite domination. Hor-Aha was succeeded by his son, King Jer, about whom we know next to nothing. His successor, King Jet, is mainly known from his striking funerary stelae. I mentioned that early kings used these steles to mark the locations of their tombs. Well, Jet's is extremely well preserved. Inside a large serac is the hieroglyph of a snake, and standing on top of the serac is a large image of a Horus falcon. Unfortunately, we know virtually nothing about his reign. After his death, his wife, Neith, likely ruled over Egypt as queen regent until her son, Hor-Den, came of age. After coming to power, the pharaoh Hor-Den claimed a slew of Egyptian firsts. I mean, let's be honest, it's not hard to be first when you're kicking off a whole new civilization, but still. Hor-Den's innovations included first ruler to use the title King of Upper and Lower Egypt, the first shown wearing both the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt and the cobra-like Nemes headdress, the first shown sprinting in what looks like an early Hebsed festival, and the first to carve reliefs of himself on the rocks of the Sinai Peninsula. His reign also saw the first use of stone as a building material and the first use of hieroglyphs for numbering. Later officials also recorded that many rituals and customs of the court had originated in Hor-Den's reign. On the less positive side, Hor-Den presided over Egypt's first recorded plague as well as its first recorded famine. And then there's the really dark part. Hor-Den's tomb was fringed by the burials of 136 men and women, all of whom had been strangled to death. The killings were meant to provide the pharaoh with manual labor in the afterlife. Luckily, this practice only occurred under this first royal house, the so-called First Egyptian Dynasty. After this, small figures called ushabtis were placed in tombs instead of actual, strangled humans. The next First Dynasty king, Enedjib, is very poorly attested. We have little except for his royal tomb and a cryptic note that says his reign may have ended in calamity. The records of his successor, Semerkhet, are also exceedingly cryptic. He may have been Enedjib's brother, another son of King Hor-Den, but theories about him usurping the throne have pretty much been debunked. Manetho records that during Semerkhet's reign there were many portents and a very great calamity. The scanty archaeological evidence appears to bear this out. A source called the Cairo Stone records that the first year of Semerkhet's reign saw, quote, the destruction of Egypt. And that's it. No elaboration or further mention of what this entry was all about by either Semerkhet or any of his successors. And BT dubs, in the years after his kingdom was destroyed, Semerkhet kept right on building statues and traveling up and down the Nile. So maybe a bit of a drama queen? Who can say? Which brings us to Semerkhet's successor, the final king of the First Egyptian Dynasty, Ka. We know very little about his reign other than it ended in conflict. Ka apparently had no male heirs, and fragmentary sources record two rivals, Snefer-Ka and Horus-Bird, who fought to succeed him to the throne. Up to this point, all 8 kings who'd ruled over Egypt had come from the same royal house. And it was far from clear at this early stage whether the pharaonic order they'd put in place could transcend that family's demise. So it's in 2900 BC, with that question looming, that we'll take our leave of Egypt, at least for the moment. Next episode, we'll return to Sumer and discuss the transition from the Uruk period to the early dynastic period. We'll dig into the histories of Kish, Mari, Ur, Lagash, and other prominent city-states as their various rulers make, break, and remake alliances, in between making war on each other like it's going out of style. We'll dig in deep on the field-based conflict that rocked the ancient world, the one between Umma and Lagash, and we'll see how that struggle set the stage for the unification of all of Mesopotamia. Next time on The Ancient World. Would you like to listen to ad-free episodes of The Ancient World and a bunch of other great history podcasts? Then go to The Ancient World Podcast on Apple Podcasts and subscribe to Airwave History Plus. You'll get a free 7-day trial to listen to ad-free episodes, bonus content, and more from the largest collection of history podcasts anywhere. So subscribe to Airwave History Plus on Apple Podcasts today.